Hi, everyone. I'm Giovanni Santamaria, Associate Professor and Department Chair at the School of Architecture and Design at the New York Institute of Technology. And on behalf of our Dean, Maria Perbellini, I would like to thank and welcome our guest today, Robert Katchur, Principal at Diller Scofidio Renfro, and all our students, faculty, alumni, and friends attending this event. This is the fourth of a 6 presentation part of the Master of Architecture course titled Special Studies in Architecture Behind the Envelope at the School of Architecture and Design, taught by Professor Tom Verebes. This is also part of our Spring 2022 lecture and event series titled Communities in the School of Architecture and Design in New York Tech. Robert Katchur will briefly present Diller Scofidio Renfro's project, The Shed, completed in 2020 in the Hudson Yards in Manhattan, followed by students-led interview with the M.Arch students, Daniel Beecher and Kale Codispoti. Thanking again all our guests and our faculty and staff who organized this event, I will now leave the stage to Professor Verebes for a brief introduction of our guests. Enjoy.
Thank you, Giovanni, for your generous and warm welcome to this event on behalf of Dean Perbellini. Good afternoon to the school community and the public joining us today. The presentation and student-led interview, as Giovanni presented, is part of 6 public presentations and interviews within my seminar, M.Arch seminar, Beyond the Envelope. And I'd like to thank Dean Perbellini, Lectures Events Committee, for integrating these events, presentations and interview events from the seminar into the Spring 2022 Lectures and Events series. And also thank you to Professor David Diamond for supporting the second run of this seminar. It was born, this seminar was born in the context of the remote context of teaching and learning in 2020, when our classroom, our design studios, and all public events had a life here on Zoom. And we configured a format for a short presentation by the architect of a recent important architectural project that we'd focus on in the seminar, primarily focusing on design, production, construction of one single building, followed by a student-led interview today by M.Arch students Daniel Beecher and Kyle Codispoti. It's a pleasure to welcome this afternoon Robert Katchur, Principal of the New York-based practice Diller Scofidio Renfro, who is Project Director for the building in focus today, The Shed, completed in Hudson Yards here in the city in 2020. Robert Katchur joined Diller and Scofidio Renfro in 2010 and became Principal of DS+R in 2018. For over a decade, he's served as the Project Director of The Shed in New York, a startup multi-arts institution originally conceived by Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. Previously, Robert led several projects within the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts Campus transformation during his time at FX Collaborative, including the Hyde Park Pavilion and Lincoln Ristorante and the 65th Street Bridge, as well as infrastructural improvements across the entire complex of Lincoln Center. A few words on The Shed before handing over to Robert. Maybe both as The Shed as an institution and as a landmark building in New York City. The Shed has been described in the architectural and art press as an anti-institutional institution. As the newest cultural venue to arrive in New York City, this new anti-institutional institution was born out of a unique relationship of the architect to a cultural institution. The Shed is situated at the northern terminus of the High Line as a cultural locus within the high-end mercantile context of Hudson Yards. As a beacon for culture, its architecture emanates light through its translucent ETFE envelope. Perhaps the most spectacular and even radical attribute of The Shed is its transformable envelope and volume, which enables The Shed to double in size. The telescoping envelope of The Shed performs as a responsive creative environment in which the retractable roof and other kinetic systems can radically transform the space where the audience, various technologies of back-of-house functions, and artists and performers all cohabit a space tailored to the particular cultural event it houses at any given time. This project builds upon the tradition, if you will, of interactive and intelligent architecture, articulating and expressing eloquently the performativity of Cedric Price's Fun Palace and the theoretical roots of cybernetics. The legacy of Cedric Price and the aspirations of subsequent generations of researchers, technologists, dreamers, and radicals is one of buildings which transform, change, learn, and adapt. The shed specifically is a large industrial shed whose mission is to augment the capacity of artists to make the building's spatial envelope change to their wishes and needs. The shed is one of these landmark architectural achievements which confirms our job as architects on the best of days is to conceive and construct buildings which make possible what seems impossible. Robert, we're grateful for you to join us today to share your presentation on the shed and then to participate in a brief interview.
Thank you so much, Tom and Giovanni and everyone else at NYIT. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes. I think you're muted, Robert.
Okay, I don't know how that happened. Can you hear me now? Okay. For DSR, the shed started very early on in its process, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. Introduce the studio for a moment, and then speak more specifically to the shed. We're a studio of about 100 architects, designers, and artists. We practice urban architecture, urban design, and installation art. And the studio was founded in 1981 by Liz Diller and Rick Scofidio as a counter practice undertaking sort of interdisciplinary and self-initiated projects in the public realm, which has really fed into our development in the shed. We're the architects and design architects for the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts redevelopment, the Broad, the High Line, and more recently we've expanded, working internationally, and there's a project there in Tianjin, Juilliard School, but even projects in Moscow and in Europe. There are our principals, our partners there. Excuse my dog. They're on the left at the shed just after the steel was erected. On the right, I've just included a couple of our more recent art projects. We produced the mile-long opera on the High Line, which was, over 1,200 opera singers singing at once along the length of the High Line, that opened a few years ago. And Deep Blue Sea with Bill T. Jones at the Armory more recently. So the shed really began, the city, as they negotiated with the MTA and the future developers of Hudson Yards, they recognized a need to reserve space for a community center or cultural use. But they were able to secure a footprint that is effectively the size of what we call the fixed building. And in this presentation, I'll refer to this component in the middle here as the fixed building, the movable shed, and then the adjacent tower that ultimately we were, I'll call it strongly encouraged to connect into. So the city was able to secure this sort of 20,000 square foot footprint in the larger eastern rail yards. And it's situated in a very strategic position along the northern edge of the High Line, the Whitney Museum at the south and the Chelsea Arts District in between, and the expansion of the theater district into the far west side, the redevelopment of Javits and other projects over here really left the shed in an important urban site. I think the question the city had was, what should it be? There are over 1,200 cultural institutions in the city. Why do we need one more? What are we missing? What do we need? And ultimately, they put out an RFP answering those questions with some parameters. And I think they really expected to get folks like the Guggenheim or MoMA or the Whitney or the Met to respond with a team of architects and a proposal. But the economy was collapsing as that idea was put forth. and in 2007 and 8. And those institutions were watching their endowments dwindle and their expansion ideas suffer. In the meantime, Liz Diller and David Rockwell, Rockwell Group was our collaborator on this, thought about what do we need, what can we do? And they were sort of informed by a process that happened just after 9/11. There was an aching need to do something down there at the Ground Zero site, and they set about finding a way to create a ramp that would allow people to see the site, the Ground Zero site. And there was no client. They sort of endeavored on it themselves, pulling resources from wherever they could, communicating with city officials and other supporters who might support it. So they had gotten a taste of like the idea of starting your own project out of thin air. And this had the city had an interest in developing a community center, but there was no group to run it. There was no client yet. And so they set about making a proposal, and the city liked it and supported it. So what we had to do was confront, well, what should it be, this new institution, and how should it serve the city? And what would be the next thing that we need? We knew that there were large format shows that were very popular in 2005 and 6 when the economy was booming, that were at the Tate in London, at the Grand Palais in Paris, Maxi in Rome, the Garage in Moscow, that couldn't come to New York because they couldn't secure the same scales of footprints. And we knew that there was a desire to have those kinds of shows be produced in New York, or exhibited in New York. So we knew it had to be scalable, it had to be big, it would benefit from being transformable, because as the economy was showing us, right as we sat and really thought about what this should be, the economy was crumbling. So we knew it had to be flexible to respond to the circumstances. The arts shrink when the economy is in dire straits, and it grows often aggressively when times are good. And we knew that there was a significant movement toward multidisciplinary needs. Of those 1,200 institutions, very few of them actually try and merge the artistic silos that exist. So you mentioned Cedric Price. That was a clear example of creating an architecture of infrastructure that could be malleable to the needs. It was obviously never built, but it served as an inspiration, and I think it set off a trend in the cultural community with Pompidou and other institutions that attempted to make it good, make it real. The site here at Hudson Yards, this is before the Eastern Rail Yards was decked over. You can see the train lines sort of expanding out into the Western Rail Yards here in the foreground, the High Line at the southern edge, and sort of a train shed building for maintenance and other things in the Eastern Rail Yards, all were there, and they all had to operate during the entire construction process. And ultimately, the Eastern Rail Yards as a construction project, in large part controlled by Related, was one of the largest US construction projects in US history. 13 million square feet, and then some as you move north. It was several thousand workers on the site every day. So as they began to deck over the site, the shed site is here on the left-hand side of the page. We had to act. We weren't necessarily in a position, we hadn't yet figured out who was going to, who the shed would be yet, but Related needed some definition. How much does this thing weigh? Where does it want to be? So we set about making some very early infrastructure decisions that we would have to live with as we move forward. And this is the whole of the Eastern Yards and the Western Yards, sort of on the lower left-hand corner. And the reason that, the way these things work, the alchemy between the MTA and New York City as the zoning regulator and Related, was that the city was really providing a series of amenities to the city, and Related and the MTA, as the landholder, were doing the commercial and residential development. So these things, the New York City subway line, the High Line, and the Shed, really added value to the whole neighborhood, but it was a way of humanizing this commercial development and making it for the public. So I mentioned the sort of 21,000 square foot footprint that was originally allocated with some sort of limit on the volume that it could be. It had a 200,000 square foot maximum square footage allowance in an agreement between the city and the MTA. So we set about creating multiple proposals, pitch books, and a business plan. Ultimately, we pitched it to the city, and Mayor Bloomberg said, "I really like this idea." We were slotted a 20-minute meeting, and we were there for an hour and a half. And he loved the idea very much, but he wanted it to balance its books. He wanted it to be a stable economic thing. So we set about creating that. We looked at ways we could develop cultural programming overlapping with income generating events so that the books could be balanced. And ultimately, you know, a serious attempt to make sure that Hudson Yards at large had a connection to the Chelsea neighborhood. And that's why the entrance is on 30th Street and not up on the public space to the north. We wanted it to be part of the neighborhood. So we use the terms nested and deployed. And as Tom mentioned, it's really based in a reinvented industrial technology. We wanted something that was entirely reliable, entirely understood, that it wasn't going to be a total invention, even though it's incredibly unique for a building to utilize this technology. And we envisioned different programming configurations that would allow these different cultural programming, private programming, and public programming. And different parts of the building could be taken over by any one of these programming configurations to make the income generating side of it be balanced out with the public mission. So something I'll mention is the way it connects into the adjacent residential tower. Originally, it was designed with a 50-foot gap in between, but as the development matured, that building kept getting wider and bigger, and the positioning of everything began to get a little too close for comfort. And ultimately, we were faced with the decision, is it better to connect or not? And one of the considerations was that this was a cultural institution on sovereign city land. It wasn't part of the development formally. It wasn't controlled by Related, and we didn't even want it to have that appearance. But there was a real benefit in how we approached this, that we could gain additional support space for it. And ultimately, it became a need to do that. And eventually Related offered us the commission to design the tower. And we took it on, sort of against our typical habits. We did it really to make sure that the two projects were synthesized together. The columns didn't appear in the middle of our galleries, and that the systems could be synthesized. So there they are, sort of during construction together. And it really occupies the lower 10 floors of space. We were able to utilize that footprint, which was, not desirable space from Related's perspective at the base of the building, to put all of the mechanicals for the shed, to put all of the dressing rooms, all of the public bathrooms, all of the things that allowed us to preserve the 21,000 square feet for public space. So this is an animation that we assembled, and I'll show you the greening of the High Line, the taking over of the yards. The steel frame of the fixed building, which is on that 21,000 square foot footprint. The engagement of the tower. And then the steel structural frame of the movable shed itself, with a full mechanical system that allows us to climate control that room when it's deployed, and the ETFE skin. So one of the things that was incredibly important for the project was the ease with which you can load in and load out. it often becomes a make or break moment for institutions. They spend a lot of money moving things around, and the easier that you can make it, then the lower the cost of entry for a given theatrical or artistic company to put on a show there. And as the shed became real, you know, and Coots came on board, and a board was developed to build the institution. You know, Alex made a decision to produce all new work, which made these things all the more important on how you get things staged into the building and how much it costs to do it. So we have a variety of ways that goods and materials can be loaded into the building so that, you know, things can happen simultaneously. We have a theatrical deck at the top of the building that allows you to easily rig whatever you need to in the main space. And we have a lot of automated systems that allows you to transform the building from one state to another.
He is abandoned. The doors are open, and the surfeited grooms do mock.
I think, in this, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. I know I want to leave enough time to have a conversation. I thought I would mention, you know, flexibility is key to the building's success, and we really viewed the architecture as one of infrastructure, offering what you would need 80% of the time, you know, with great ease. So in the exhibition galleries, which were designed to be flexible between different, you know, very light-filled modes and darkened room modes. This is the Reich Richter Parrot, which was the first show that the shed launched in its inaugural year. And it was a mix of music and painting and singing. And so the galleries are all very flexibly designed. You can demise them both mechanically and spatially into a series of smaller spaces so that you can create intimacy where you need to create intimacy. There's distributed power in the floor and in the ceiling. The walls can carry 440 pounds of weight around the perimeter. And there's anchors in the floor every 10 feet to permit any number of arrangements of walls that you might want to create for a given show. And those anchors are strong enough to support cantilevered walls that are thin in nature, between, you know, 14 and 18 feet tall, and still meet code and carry the art on them as needed. And indeed, the shed has done all of those things in the years since it's been opened. That was from the Agnes Dennis show. The theater up on level 6 is a black box theater that can have 500 seats in an arrangement facing a singular stage, or it can be set up into 2 separate rooms that have smaller, more intimate arrangements. And the shed, it's got a series of flexible seating wagons that can be stored within the base of the tower, that can, when they're closed, roll down a hallway, and then alternatively create steep rakes or shallow rakes. And here's the 500 seat arrangement. And in some cases, this is a show that the shed produced called Maze, where the Flex and Dance group actually had very little seating, where the audience actually stood around them and began to perform with them. So it was a very interactive dance show. And each of these spaces has been designed to connect into the main space. So you could have a show where, you know, you're in the black box theater, but you use the McCourt as a deep well of space. The McCourt itself is about 115 feet tall inside, with that theatrical grid above. We envisioned it serving a variety of purposes. The frame itself is sort of, we like to call it all muscle, no fat. These are the air delivery systems, the ductwork coming down. It's married up, it's constructed out of steel the same way that the structure is. And it allows air to be delivered down low in the space, and the rigging systems are all up high in the space. So there's space up there to maneuver around chain motors and hoists and theatrical flies as you need to. The floor is loaded with power and data and convenience power, as well as loading capacity. And then the room can be blacked out with a robust heavy shade system that blocks out light and sound. It's based on a sailing system that's used to unfurl large format sailboats with a carbon fiber sail material, which is loaded with weight and which can control and isolate sound. And then the way we connect the fixed building and the McCourt, allowing for an interaction between those different spaces. So, Fashion Week was a primary driver in the considerations in the shed, and they often have overlooks and booths and party rooms that overlook the shows down below. So a variety of different seating arrangements can be installed. You can create a balcony on the second level gallery, or you can create an event with a standing room only sort of floor space. And this was the opening show called Soundtrack of America. This was the second show was Bjork, and there was a Chinese opera that took advantage of the space and flew people high up into the room. So I see that I'm probably 20 minutes in. Tom, why don't you tell me if I've got some technical material, but we can
Absolutely fine. Please take the time.
You want me to keep going?
Please take the time.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
So when we think about the infrastructure, we did this animation that sort of overlaid all of the different systems, rudimentary systems as well as sophisticated ones, the plumbing, the electrical, the mechanical, the air distribution for the facade systems, the ETFE, the kinetic systems, and then all the things that really control all of those. And we sort of, the degree of coordination and getting all of that stuff to synchronize and work together was maybe one of the hardest parts of the project. And the project has a lot of programmatic aspirations, but I would say that equally difficult in execution was making sure that all of these systems came together technically to live amongst one another and be there when the artists need them. Because that's all of the end goal of this is to make it easy and accommodating to any artistic vision that people want to put into the building. So when we undertook these designs, the geometry of the shed arises out of these analyses of the structural needs. When you have a movable building that has to be entirely open on one side, looking at the lateral forces, the longitudinal forces, the gravity forces, the diagrid that is the structural expression is a response to that. And the diagrid allows all the structure to remain incredibly light, which is extraordinarily important to keeping the kinetic systems under control. The entire system is moved by about 180 horsepower of electric motors, simple electric motors that, a Prius is about 160, 165 horsepower. So we're moving an 8 million pound building fully loaded with all the theatrical gear that they might put in it with an engine slightly bigger than a Prius. So we assembled, with the help of Thornton Tomasetti, who are our structural engineers, and JB&B, our MEP engineers, some analytics that we put on display in a gallery opening in Germany a few years ago. So these are images from that presentation. And of course, life safety were big concerns as well. We looked at glare analyses, making sure that art could be displayed in the room comfortably. That influenced the frit selection on the ETFE itself. We wanted to soften the light, not let harsh sunlight come in. We looked at, we'll let this play for just a second here and see if we can maybe move it along. This was an air distribution analysis that we did to make sure that we were conditioning the space down low, but not, spending too much energy conditioning space where people couldn't be up high in the space. And then, of course, life safety. If a fire happens in here, if they bring in a tractor trailer's worth of gear and something goes wrong, what happens? So, there's enough smoke evacuation in here to maintain a safe level of fresh air at the bottom of the room if something bad were to occur. So we set about making sure that we got the best steel contractors in the world because we knew how important the expression of the steel was, and we hosted. We asked them to do mock-ups in 3 different countries, in Canada, Italy, and in Spain. Ultimately, the Italians won. They had we analyzed each of them and for deviations against the theoretical model. And the Italians did a terrific job, as the company's named Chimolai, and they set about the project. It's a mix of high technology and low technology. There's a lot of hand tools involved in making sure it's just right. These are some of the more complex pieces in their yard or in their factory. We asked them to do dry fits of the tail fins, which they laid out in their yard in Italy, and we went to see. It was quite a beautiful. You can see the scale of a person here. And the kinetic systems, they also undertook the kinetic systems, which was really beneficial because the two needed to be in sync, the structure and the kinetic systems. And the way it works is these electric motors are on the roof of the fixed building, out of sight, not of touch. And it just drives along a rack and pinion system. And the wheels at the bottom are simple, dumb wheels. It's a little bit like a shopping cart where the motive force is up high and the wheels at the bottom just spin. These are the motors at the top, and they're now mounted on the fixed building roof. Each of these motors are 15 horsepower motors. There's 12 of them. And that's the wheel. It has a special tapered bearing system in the center to reduce all friction. And that's what allows these motors to be so light gauge. So you have a bearing, you have an inner wheel and an outer wheel and an axle that was friction fit into the structural system, that the gimbal that connected to the structural frame. They superheated the gimbal and they super cooled the axle, slipped them together and allowed them to come back to temp. This is the wheels are made of high strength steel. This is a blacksmith on a mega scale. They're pounding the steel to tighten the molecules so that they end up with a piece like this that they can mill down into a wheel, ultimately combining them with the bearings and the axle. And there's a wheel ready for shipment. And here it is flying in. I'm going to move through these very quickly, but it was pretty thrilling to see these pieces come together in the field. And now that it's all covered with ETFE, it's hard to imagine what it was. It was all staged against the fixed building. We used the fixed building as the scaffold structure to support the shed erection. The riggers had to figure out how to tip and fly these X-shaped pieces, and then they would just simply bolt together. And the bolts are internalized into the system so that you don't see them. There are the motors. And eventually they connected it across the top. And then they began to build the eastern edge, which included the double bogies, which weigh about 50 tons. That's a single bogie, which is about 25 tons. This was we had a party when we rolled it the first time, and this was just after it was deployed. You can see there's about 700 people packed in that adjacent plaza. And then the ETFE, which was integral to the success of the design because of it, it is 1/100th the weight of glass. It is, it's inflated. It has a long track record now going on over 50 years. Some of the oldest projects are still intact and holding up. It's an extruded resin that is, a chemical that is related to Teflon. Its thermal performance is similar to insulated glass, but it's ultra lightweight. It weighs 1/100th the weight of glass, and it's flexible. So, when you consider a moving building, if we thought about the weight of the glass, the weight of the steel that would hold the glass, and the joints that you would have to put between those panels of glass, it would have changed the very nature of the structure dramatically. It's hard to estimate against something you didn't do, but we estimate that we probably saved 25 to 30% of the overall steel weight by choosing ETFE. It was produced by Vector Foil Tech in Bremen, Germany. And in these cases, there's a center foil, and in some cases, there's two outer foils, or in some cases, just a single outer foil. So it's a two-chamber system that is inflated and balanced. These are the extrusions that we were considering for capturing them. You know, they come as uninflated plastic foils. They get clipped into these aluminum extrusions, and then they get inflated. There it is in progress. The brave Vector Foil Tech installers. The ones at the top, the curved ones, were probably the most complex, trying to figure out how to bend over a balloon over itself functionally. So the shows, the Bjork show and the Chinese opera, they host food trucks sometimes, and they open it to the public at large. We've hosted the Frieze Art Fair in recent years. Nested, they used it nested over the summers mostly when they can enjoy the weather. And we were proud to host the New York Philharmonic in its inaugural concert after the pandemic, the first concert they were able to host. And because of the shed's flexibility, we could have all the social distancing that they needed. So I'm sorry I went over my time, but I hope I made it efficient enough.
Thank you so much, Robert. There's so much you presented that just either is either not visible when one visits the shed or in the various publications. So your presentation is really invaluable to our students here and really to the public to present the project in all of its conceptual and intellectual ambitions and technical achievements as well. I'll pass the screen and microphone over to Daniel Beecher and Kyle Codispoti, who will conduct the interview. So part B.
Shall I stop sharing?
Sure.
Hi, how are you? My name is Kyle Codispoti, and my partner's name is Daniel Beecher, and we would like to thank you for the fantastic slides that you presented. It was an honor researching the shed. It was really interesting, and it was great to hear your take on the project. So we learned a lot. But without further ado, I'm going to slide this over to Daniel, and he's going to start with the first question.
Hi, how are you guys? So I'll just start off with question number one. In the urban context of Hudson Yards, also known as the Billionaire's Playground, in which this new cultural institution is co-present with commercial offices, high-end residential, luxury shopping, and also serves as the northern terminus of the High Line, which snakes through Chelsea. The shed presents itself as a new anti-institutional institution, as a nonprofit organization, which was conceived in response to the 2008 request for proposals issued by the City of New York. What was the architect's role in shaping the institution of the shed and its specific architectural manifestation, as the architects were on board much earlier than typically? Can you share with us the architect-client relationship?
Sure. I mean, I would say that while we did a lot of thinking and a lot of researching about what it should be, you know, we had a consistent and deep relationship with the city the whole way along. Michael Bloomberg and Kate Levin, who was his Cultural Affairs Commissioner, were sort of with us along every step of the way. But what we didn't know in the beginning was who ultimately was going to run it on a day-to-day perspective, and how we should plan the building that would allow for any number of sort of artistic visions to take hold. So one of the things we did was we set up, with Kate's help, we interviewed and met with over 40 different New York City cultural institutions and asked them, what do you regret most about your own facility? What do you ache to have that you don't have? If you were, we wanted them to see this as a sister institution that they could interact with, that they could you know, potentially take a show to, you know, if you're a theater of a smaller size and eventually you have a hit show and you want to move it up to a venue that has maybe more capacity, you could bring it to the shed. Things could be developed in concert and those kinds of things. So, we met with any number of institutions, big and small, from the Guggenheim and the Whitney and the Met, also at small theaters in Brooklyn, St. Anne's and others, a whole wide range of people so that we could sort of aggregate all of those different needs. And a number of them were very generous with their time and shared their technical needs with us. And what we did was, lots of times flexible architecture becomes generic in a way that's good for no one and specialized for, an abstract idea. And what we tried to do was take a lot of specific information and overlay it on all of the other specific information we got and look for the common points and look for what would give us the biggest bang for our buck. If we arrange power like this, if we arrange structural capacity like that, what's the cadence and spacing that those things should all have? What are the right capacities in those systems? If you look at what Fashion Week puts on each year for their Fashion Week show, there's a lot of show power that goes into those things. We made sure that while we were trying to be responsible about how much power we put into the building, we made sure that the power we had there could get to each floor. So there are sort of centers distributed around the building, but you can take it down below through hatches and other things, make it all maneuverable. So we took all of that, I'll call it raw data, and we tried to synthesize it into a formal technical program that, as we moved along, we took on more and more regular inputs from some of those other institutions. The Shed they had by that point created a board. They'd created a group of people who could begin to respond and play off of us, and as we designed it. So it was about maintaining flexibility, and if it offered true flexibility, it became part of the program. And then in 2015, the Shed was moving along as an institution enough that they ultimately engaged Alex Poots, who really gave it new heft and girth in its aspirations, and he wanted to produce new work, and which was something that was very much in sync with how we envisioned it prior to his arrival, but he really breathed new life into it.
Also, just branching off that, you touched on it a little bit, but in light of this, I wanted to ask a similar question. Could you summarize the role of the architecture of the Shed in shaping the artistic activities which take place within its programming? So that would include visual arts, performing arts, dance, theater, music, and more specifically, how are artists challenged by the architecture of the Shed itself?
I guess I would say that the way an artist would approach the building, if you're going to be in the McCourt itself, the movable Shed component, or in something that is that plus connected into some of the other spaces, the show has to be visually powerful enough to take over the space and feel like it's present. So the scale of it, but if they are developing something very intimate or something very small, the spaces within the fixed building can be demised to create the level of intimacy they might want. So what we tried to do was we called it the 80-20 rule. We want to make sure that we can accommodate 80% of what's out there very easily. And of course, there will always be a unique invention that doesn't fit the paradigm, the way you envisioned. That's the part of this that's impossible or difficult, is the unknown. So we tried not to spend a lot of money and energy on things that would only happen 2% of the time. So as far as what we tried to do is create a canvas that would easily support whatever the ambition was. And frankly, what the artists have done with it, I don't know if anybody has seen the Saraceno show that's on right now, just about to end. It's probably the most exuberant use of that space without ever seeing it. It's a 95-foot inflatable globe inside the room, and you can walk off of the upper levels or climb up into the space 40 feet into the air and walk on a net. You're seeing people in the middle of the space. It's really tremendous. And in the galleries, he's subdivided them so that you can look very intimately at individual spider webs that have been grown or allowed to grow on small curios. So that show sort of touches all the different scales that we ever envisioned. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, yeah, it did. Thank you.
Thank you. Altogether, the kinetic systems of the shed, its retractable roof and other interactive lighting, sound, and seating systems create a responsive and interactive environment. As you have presented, the intention is for the artist to interact with the space to alter it on demand through a set of kinetic systems, doubling in size. In this light, the shed is a built manifestation of some of the ideas of interaction with intelligent spaces charged with capacities to transform of Cedric Price's fun house. Through our research, we start to understand the flexible program elements that are achieved through the shed's design. As architects, we are trained to work through a process to find our final product, making us intrigued on how the ultimate decision of the expanding facade came to fruition. Can you please further explain the process that led you to the design and its tectonics on how we can now rethink the principle form follows function?
Well, I guess it's similar to what I just mentioned about the process that we undertook was kind of relentless testing, and we did what we called stress tests. We engaged a group of producers that took shows around the country and asked them to share with us we asked them to give us a range of scales and shows, and we overlaid them on our preliminary plans, and where we saw that we could adjust. Could you bring this show from the Tate here? Could you bring that show from any number of institutions, and how would it lay out here? If you said, I want to do the Ring, the opera, how would it fit? And what would the troubles be? Would there be a deal breaker in there? Could you accommodate its load? Could you accommodate its power needs? Could you accommodate its rigging needs? And I would say, I mentioned reaching out and having communication with over 40 different institutions, and then a smaller subset of them where we had really deep technical exchanges. We also were doing that in parallel, where we were doing these stress tests. And I would say at the end of each phase, we tried to do that so that, we could make sure that whatever happened for coordination, for cost control, for efficiencies, we made sure that at the end of any period of intense design that we hadn't lost anything that we thought we shouldn't lose. So I think it was kind of a hard look internally to some degree. When you have a pre-existing group of clients, they very well know what they need. They may not be always to explain it well, but through the process that we typically go through, you kind of get to it. In this case, without the permanent people there yet, we had to use surrogates. And so we tried, it almost made us more rigorous about sort of stress testing the plan.
Based off of everything that you're saying now, we can determine that the architect's role within the project is very important. Because of this approach to transformable architecture can lead to countless possibilities for the arts community and more. With that said, how important was this project to Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro in terms of its future role as a precedent for projects that can invite more flexibility in how we occupy space?
I would say very important. We've begun to sort of take all of what we learned here and apply it. Oftentimes you have a client who says, well, I only have this much space, but I want that much stuff, right? And how do you, or I have this much budget and I want that much stuff. So I would say the lessons that we learned here have been invaluable in confronting those kinds of questions with new clients and new projects around the world. It's only going to continue to get more extreme as density increases in cities, the populations continue to grow, space will become more and more of a premium. So the means by which you utilize that space will become more important. And it also, maybe more importantly, runs along the terms of environmental efficiency. Buildings should not become weight elephants that aren't utilized in full force. And I think it's going to, if I try to look far into the future, I think these issues are going to be more and more and more important as we try and be more and more efficient with everything we create and make in the world. Buildings are they're heavy, they're cumbersome, they're fixed, they're there for good, and they should be responsive for the longest period of time possible.
No, thank you. But as we spoke about, just to further dive into it, the shed through its kinetic behavior can double in size, allowing more possibilities that can be invited into the site. Due to this exchange, the scale of the project changes. In relation to scale, the assembly of the wheels feels if they have a very specific design goal and expands the site's relationship to its visitors. The project is a critique of modernist notion of flexibility, most often expressed architecturally as a large fixed open space in which users have more limited control over the architecture's configuration. Why does the shed need to double in size? More specifically, how could this project for a cross-disciplinary arts venue be achieved using a generic black box or a white cube as fixed volumes rather than using kinetics to create flexibility?
Well, why does the shed need to double in size? I guess it was, to some degree, it was a dilemma presented by Hudson Yards itself, where 20,000 square feet of footprint was allocated to this cultural need. At the same time, there was a mandate to find Fashion Week a permanent home. It had been camping out in every major public space in the city, and every time it does, there's conflict with the local neighborhood, and the ability to host is extraordinarily expensive for this major industry in New York. So when you look at a 21,000 square foot footprint against just that one event, which has 3 full-length runways, and all that goes with it, and somewhere between 600 and 1,200 patrons seated around that runway, the two don't align. So you say, well, on only certain moments of the year do I need all of that dimension. And moreover, if you compare events versus footprint, moreover, if you compare economic ups and downs, the trends that were in place in the artistic community at the beginning of the project were Richard Serra's large format mega projects, where you're installing massive steel pieces in very, very large spaces. The Guggenheim, there was a race going on who could have the biggest freight elevator in their institution. These elevators were becoming as big as New York City apartments, maybe ×2. So that was the trend that day. But of course, 2 years later, when the economy fell out from under all of us, all of a sudden, all of these institutions are starving and probably struggling to put on, medium-sized shows. So that's why we wanted the building to be responsive. If you just left it big and generic, you couldn't put a small, intimate thing within it and have it feel right. It would feel like a white elephant with a very small jewel in it. So that was the drive for the malleability of the scale. But there's also a real need for outdoor public space. And every New York City institution that has it, it's always in demand. If you look at the Met exterior gallery, it's a very popular thing. The Whitney, he just put in that outside space at the south end of the High Line. It's also in short supply, right? So we felt like we could offer a significant amount of it for chunks of the year by nesting, and then expand over it when you need it.
As you were presenting, we saw the development of the wheels, and we found that very interesting. While we were doing our research, we were intrigued by it. So when you touched upon it, we were definitely intrigued. Can you expand on the benefits that went behind the human scale tracks and why it was important to achieve this aesthetic to support its function?
Oh, we were interested in the wheels explaining to some degree when the building wasn't moving that it could move. The wheels kind of do that just by being there. The scale of the wheel is directly connected to the weight of the building. We needed a certain amount of surface area to land that 8 million pounds. And right now there are 8 wheels and there are 8 million pounds to bring down to the ground. So in really simple terms, if I'm not talking about wind load and other things, 1 million pounds is coming through, that size of footprint. The wheel touchdown point is just the bottom tangent point of the wheel against the rail. And you mentioned the rail is human scale. We needed that surface to be a floor, part of a room, sometimes part of a plaza, other times where you can't catch your heel in it. There's a lot of technical sides to it, like a normal train station, or the tracks are away from you. Rail crossings at grade, are often humpity bumpity things that cars don't move over smoothly. So we needed it to be architectural floor. So, ultimately there was the rail that was selected was due to the load. It's an 8-inch wide rail, which is several times bigger than a traditional commuter rail in the United States. It's the largest commercially available rail, and it's that's actually fabricated, and it's used for gantry cranes in rail yards for shipping. We said we needed to stay within that limit. And so those are the things, when you look at the weight of the building and the decisions we made about ETFE, the decisions we made about the acoustic liner system, every one of those fed all of those dimensions because of the rolling nature of the load.
Right, thank you. I'm going to take the next question. In our seminar, we're looking at 6 outstanding build projects analyzed in relation to a set of 6 themes. This week's theme is visuality and experience, with the shed exemplifying this topic. Actually, as you just mentioned, with the wheel visualizing the mobility of it. Aside from the shed's reconfigurable programmatic achievements, visually speaking, there are specific design decisions which creates the shed's presence and brings attention to it in the context of the neighboring buildings of Hudson Yards as a district glowing building at the northern destination of the High Line. Can you please talk more about the importance of materiality with the shed, specifically the ETFE envelope, and how this material accentuates the shed's presence in this context?
Sure. I've mentioned several times that it was fundamental to the technical development of the project, but like how we shaped it and how we wanted this building to stand out against the commercial buildings that were around it. We wanted it to be unique, and the tufting of the pillows and the fact they have about a 22-inch standoff between their attachment points and the sort of tip of the curve in the center of the pillow, which gives it that sort of very tufted look, which is something that certainly sets it apart from its neighbors. And the frit that we selected that went on the outer foil of the ETFE assembly, we selected specifically to give it a certain amount of mass from the outside, but it also achieved, I think I mentioned, the glare controls and the light control when you allow the room to be light filled inside. But what's kind of magical about it is that it does control the light, but it doesn't entirely block your view, but nor does it act like a sheet of glass. You're not just in a structural frame where you can see the buildings outside. It sort of mutes the city a little bit and creates a more contemplative space within. And sorry, the dog wants to answer the next question. So the ETFE was kind of central to the exterior appearance, the interior appearance, and its appearance at night, where we did want it to be a glowing lantern. And even when we draw the blackout shades down, there's a lighting system within that cavity between the blackout shade and the ETFE that gives it a presence at night. And we worked very, very hard to make sure that came off. There's a lot of lights buried in those nodes where each piece of steel crosses. There's a pocket in there to house the lights.
And based on the way that you just described this, it kind of answers this next question a little bit. But either way, was this material choice something that you guys wanted to achieve early on, or did this material choice and its possible visual effects come later on in the design process?
It was very early.
Yeah, I figured.
Because it was the obvious choice from a weight perspective. It had a dramatic impact on the shaping of the steel and the lightness that it could achieve. Had we selected something heavier, we would have seen something that was, rather than like 15% of the surface area in steel, it would have been more like 30%. So from our perspective, we did not want it to look like a lumbering, hulking piece of metal. We wanted it to look far more delicate. And that's why, if you look at the individual members, they actually follow the structural diagram. The load is the smallest in the middle, where we come together, and it gets thicker as you come to the moment connections of the diagrid, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro as an architectural practice have grown immensely to increase in size and have taken on larger and more complex projects in recent years. Commonly, architects use precedents as a starting groundwork for their designs. With that said, were there any past projects at Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro that helped influence the design that led to the shed?
Yeah, I would say a couple that are kind of imbued in the history of the studio, and a couple that sort of were very much. So the first one I would say is the Blur project, which is an exposition. I'm going to call it a building. It's an installation on a lake in Geneva, where ostensibly it was a space frame that had about, I don't know how many thousands of nozzles, but basically it expelled pellets of water, instantly became a cloud as it blew. So you donned a raincoat and you explored the exhibit with this sort of mist all around you. That took that sort of, I'm going to call it a naive aspiration married up with a desire and need to tear apart the technical aspects of it to make it happen, is sort of foundational to the studio, right? The only way you're going to achieve those aspirations is to figure out the technical side that would prevent you from otherwise achieving it. That's sort of the first thought I have on answering your question. The other one, though, is a little less obvious, I think. Lincoln Center was a big project, and Diller, Scofidio, Renfro did it with executive architects as partners, and it took a lot of manpower. But what it took almost most importantly was a tremendous amount of diplomacy between 22 separate city agencies that had to be negotiated with, from DOT to all the different utility providers, 13 separate cultural institutions within Lincoln Center, and every one of them had a right of refusal, which was why, if you look at the history of Lincoln Center's redevelopment, there are many plans by many brilliant architects that never got out of the ground. And the cultural diplomacy, the sort of hearing everybody and making sure that you take what they care about most and making sure that your proposal is responsive, it gets harder and harder as there are more and more of them. So there was a certain amount of drive and relentless listening that went into that process. And I don't think we would have been as well equipped to do this without that experience.
Due to the shed having many unique qualities that have led to a successful design outcome, were there any components that you learned through the shed that led into new projects? Or in other words, what impact has the shed had on projects in your office since its completion?
In the beginning days of the shed, there were many people in the studio who thought, well, this is a great idea, but who's going to build it? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to, why is this ever going to come about? I think the principal lesson that we walk away with is that never say it's impossible, right? You might need certain things to fall your way. But whether it be a technical problem or a political problem or a technical problem, I think we carry the lessons out of it into each of the new projects, especially the ones that really want more than something is off, that looks like it's feasible. And I know that it has had influence on a number of projects where when a client says, well, I know I have to choose between these two, and we say, well, wait, maybe you don't have to choose. Let's see if we can find a way to overlap all the constituent needs of those two desires and make them harmonize. And you might have to give up on having each of them 100% of the time, but you might get each of them as much as you need them. So anyway, I think that answers your question. And
No, it does. But thank you. That concludes our time for the interview, but we really appreciate your time and your answers. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Robert, really so much for taking the time for your presentation and also for this interview. We're grateful for the support that you exhibit by this for New York Tech, for the experience for our students, Daniel and Kyle, but also in the seminar here visible on one of the screens. And so thank you for your time and for putting together such an amazing presentation. And also thank you to Liz Diller for facilitating this as well, and your team at Diller Scofidio Renfro. Thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you all so much for having me.